Coming up, do I need to replace clutch set, flywheel struggles, more dirt and grime, and finally putting everything back together. Last time I promised to check whether a stronger acid would work against the aluminium oxidation, and unfortunately it didn't make much of a difference. At this point the only real way to improve it further would be media blasting, but since I'm not doing a full engine teardown, media blasting is not an option, so I have decided to leave it as it is. As long as everything is properly cleaned, I'm okay with a bit of oxidation here and there. Alright, let's start with the clutch and rear engine work. The first thing I removed was the breather cover on top of the engine block. We need to change the gasket on it. The breather is there to vent the crankcase pressures, so that's why it is greasy around it. After that I removed the starter motor mounting. Unfortunately, the plastic cover that sits over the starter broke during the removal, so it means I will have to order a new one. Next, I removed the voltage regulator from the front of the engine, which finally allowed me to take out the starter motor. Once it was out, it was obvious how dirty everything was inside, and the paint on the starter had started to peel, and the entire area was covered in grime. So clearly the starter would need a proper refresh later and probably repainting. Now we can move on to the clutch. The first thing I did was rotate the crankshaft from the front of the engine using the alternator bolt. I was looking for the OT mark in the timing window, which indicates top dead center on the compression stroke, and I wanted to make sure that flywheel, clutch and crankshaft all stay in the same position during the disassembly and reassembly. Another very important step here is blocking the crankshaft from moving forward. If it does, the thrust washers inside the engine can fall off, and that means a complete engine teardown. And to prevent this, I just placed several Scotch-Brite pads at the front of the alternator and then reinstalled the front engine cover so to keep everything in place. This way, even if pressure is applied from the rear side, the crankshaft cannot move forward. And with that done, I moved to the rear of the engine and double checked the OT mark so I could keep track of it throughout the entire process. And now it's time to remove the clutch set. First, I unscrewed these 6M6 bolts. I was expecting more resistance from these bolts, to be honest, considering how everything looks rusty and dirty, but eventually they came out easily. Again, I made sure to keep the track of the top dead center. I tried to remove the clutch set by hands, but at the end, there's no job that hammer cannot do so. Then I inspected everything, and this spring looks okay. There are no cracks or any deformations. This is the pressure plate. Also no signs of uneven wear, no discoloration, really good. We'll keep this one. This is the friction disc. Even though it looks dirty, the good thing it is even weared. I'm going to check the thickness. It is 5 mm, so I'm going to replace it because it is on the lower edge. Service range is between 4.5 and 6. And this is the intermediate. Pressure plate also looks okay, so at the end we are replacing the spring and the friction plate only. Good. Next step is the flywheel. To remove it, the crankshaft needs to be locked so it doesn't rotate, and here I'm using a BMW special tool to block it. Flywheel bolts were really tight, and a normal wrench wasn't enough because the handle is short, so I switched to a long torque wrench, and with some effort all 5 bolts came out. And then I made sure the flywheel was still an OT mark. On BMW models between 1975 and 1980, including this one from March 1980, the flywheel is extremely difficult to remove, and the earlier models were a bit easier, and later models practically fall off once the bolts are removed. And unfortunately, this one sits right in that problematic range. So I tried reinstalling a few bolts and rocking the flywheel using pliers. It wouldn't move, so I decided to make a custom puller, so to say. I bought a simple steel plate, cut it to a size larger than the engine block diameter, measured the bolt pattern on the flywheel, and drilled 8mm holes. I used long bolts with additional nuts and used the plate as a makeshift puller. At first, the plate started bending, so I added leverage and applied more controlled force. Eventually, the flywheel let go off with a noticeable click and finally came off. And this is the O-ring that we have to replace as well. With the flywheel removed, I marked the crankshaft position again and moved onto the rear main seal and oil pump cover. Everything was extremely dirty, so before replacing anything, cleaning was mandatory. I protected the engine internals using the plastic ring that comes with the new rear main seal and added a nylon sheet to prevent debris from entering the engine. And I slightly lifted the front of the engine so cleaning fluids could drain out instead of just pooling inside. I sprayed everything with the engine cleaner, both starter housing and also the rear part. I started with different types of the brushes. Also I used a spray cleaner for really stubborn dirt. And I ran out of the supplies, and because it is Sunday I ended up using diesel fuel, and with proper protection actually it really worked really well. And since everything was already accessible, I also cleaned the outside of the engine block. In a future episode I will be removing the cylinders and heads to replace pusher tube seals and also the piston rings, but it made sense to clean the block right now. I will clean it also a bit more in details once I take out the cylinders as well. And after cleaning, I removed the old rear main seal. Simple screwdriver and metal lever did a job. I lightly polished the sealing surface with 1200 grit sandpaper, cleaned everything thoroughly. Then to install the new seal, I used special BMW tool to align the seal perfectly. This one is mounted on these 5 bolts and it makes sure that everything is really nicely aligned and flushed. Then I moved to the oil pump. First I unscrewed these 4 bolts holding the cover. And this is the old O-ring. It was no longer round but flattened into a D shape. I inspected the oil pump components carefully and found no damage, so no further work was needed. Everything was cleaned, lightly oiled. Fitted new O-ring and reassembled using medium strength Loctite thread locker. The bolts were torqued to 10 Newton meters. Then I installed the new O-ring. And this is the OT mark in a correct position. Washer, completely new flywheel bolts. Crankshaft blocker. And tighten up everything in a star pattern in a stages up to 105 Newton meters. Once everything was secured, I removed the crankshaft blocker and verified that the engine rotated freely. And now for the clutch reassembly. We have new friction disc and new spring. New M6 bolts. First goes intermediate pressure plate, then the friction disc, and at the end the pressure plate. Since I don't have a clutch centering tool, I improvised using a socket. the rubber inset from the spark plug socket and washers. With a really long bolt, I carefully center the clutch. Double check the alignment. And even test fitted the gearbox to be absolutely sure before torquing the bolts to 10 Newton meters. With the clutch finished, I reinstalled the breather using a new gasket. Now it is the time to refresh the starter motor. I disassembled what I could. I cleaned the contacts, removed the grease and dirt. And then I used masking tape to mask the plastic and parts that I don't want to be painted. Cleaned everything with anti-silicone cleaner, and I used satin black paint in 3 layers. And I'm really satisfied with the result. And this is the new cover for the starter motor. And finally I moved on to take out the ignition sensor because I saw some grease underneath. And then I replaced this O-ring on the ignition sensor. Once everything was cleaned enough, I reinstalled the sensor carefully to avoid major timing changes. I'm going to do the timing adjustments eventually at the end. And with that, this stage of the engine refresh is complete. Compared how it looked before, dirty and leaking, this engine is now cleaned, sealed and ready for the next phase. Next up, cylinders and piston rings. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. Thanks for watching and stay tuned.